Dr. Very pleased to have Dr. Whitla with us. Is that how you pronounce your name? I always wonder.
Whitla, that's correct.
Whitla, Dr. Whitla with us. And so I think it's a difficult subject, and we're delighted with your attention. So thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. Well, thank you, Douglas and John, for the invitation to be here this evening with you at the Scottish Reformation Society. It's a privilege to be asked to deliver this paper. Church history in general and Christian biography in particular are among the most useful and I think also underappreciated tools that the church possesses for the edification of the saints. Quite apart from the approachability of the genre and the readability of the genre, I trust we all enjoy stories. The student of church history gains a contextualized understanding of a lengthy period of church history, learning from the common Christian experience of brothers and sisters across the ages. And this evening, it's my privilege to present this paper on the life and times of Sir Archibald Johnston of Wariston, 1611 to 1663. Lord Wariston was one of the main architects of the Scottish Covenanting movement, a towering public figure in the turbulent landscape of mid-17th century Britain, and yet it's probably fair to say that he remains one of the most neglected figures of the Scottish Second Reformation period. And that, I think, is to our great loss, for he provides a valuable perspective on a critical moment in our national and ecclesiastical heritage. And thanks to the copious spiritual diary he left behind, he also provides the church with rich pastoral, practical lessons for today. Wariston's probably best known as the co-author of the National Covenant and Solemn League and Covenant. He also served as the clerk of the Great Reforming General Assembly of 1638 in Glasgow, which abolished episcopacy and re-established Presbyterianism in Scotland. He was also a high-profile diplomat for the Covenanter, serving as a Scottish commissioner during the Bishops' Wars. He negotiated the Treaty of London with Charles I. He was also a commissioner to the Westminster Assembly of Divines, as well as the Committee of Both Kingdoms, which effectively ran the Civil War for the English Parliament. He served as the Clerk Register of Scotland, the keeper of the national records. And these are just a few of the hats he wore. And of course, to crown his remarkable career, he is normally reckoned to be the third Covenanter martyr following the Restoration, being hanged for treason in 1663. Now, if you look at that screen and see that resume, that CV, if you will, it's clear that Wariston was no peripheral figure in our history. He is one of the most important Covenanter leaders, and as such, he has often been stylized by Covenanter histories as the heroic lawyer of the Covenant. It was lionized in 19th century Covenanter poetry, such as that of Harriet Menteith, who relates his role in the signing of the Covenant in Greyfriars Kirkyard in perhaps rather excessive terms. She says, "And now with tone distinct and clear, as one whose word is power, Johnston of Wariston stood forth, God's gift in danger's hour, a mighty parchment in his hand, from which he read the while, a sudden sunburst filled the place with heaven's approving smile." Now, whatever you make of that as history or poetry for that matter, there is, of course, another side to the story. Because for all his prominence, Wariston remains and was in his time a controversial and polarizing figure. Most of his contemporaries, friends and foes alike, found him very difficult to work with. He was known for his fiery temper and what today we might call an obsessive compulsive temperament. Nor was he oblivious to his faults. Virtually the first thing he said in his final speech from the scaffold was this: I confess that my natural temperament hath been hasty and passionate, and that in manner of going about and prosecuting the best pieces of work and service to the Lord and to my generation, I have been subject to my excess of heat, which hath no doubt offended standers by and lookers on, whereby the beauty and glory of that work hath been much obscured. Now, these words of Wariston have indeed proved prophetic, because to this day, the few historians who have studied Wariston as standers by and lookers on have found it hard to see beyond his many faults to find anything positive in what he stood for as a Covenanter. Prominent modern historians have described him as, quote, a symbol of religious fanaticism, of extremism, rigidity, mercilessness, an archetype of the grim Calvinist. That's David Stevenson. Ted Cowan goes as far as calling him a religious maniac. So while Wariston accomplished much for which we are no doubt thankful, he also, I think, stands as a warning for how zeal without knowledge can bring disrepute on our theology, our church, and our Lord. Now, Wariston's wide-reaching reputation has understandably resulted in a wide-ranging historiography. Our tendency can be, I think, to leap to the defense of one of our forefathers and rescue his reputation from the aspersions of the secular historical establishment. But as we consider the contours of his life and career this evening, we need to remember that however much in sympathy we may be with our subject and the Second Reformation cause he lived and died for, the Christian historian should also be free from whitewashing our heroes. We need to study our champions of the faith sympathetically, but objectively, and try to walk that tightrope between the extremes of character assassination and hagiography. And neither of these extremes, I think, honor the person being studied, nor indeed the Lord of history. I'd like to divide the rest of my time into 5 headings that I think outline Wariston's life rather well. First, we will consider crisis, 1611 to 37, Covenanting, 1637 to 41, Confederation, 1641 to 51, Compromise, 1652 to 60, and finally Compunction, 1660 to 1663. These will be the 5 chapters of our story this evening. Let's begin with crisis, 1611 to 1637. Wariston was born in Edinburgh in 1611, of staunch Presbyterian stock. In fact, his Presbyterian pedigree could hardly have been more impeccable. His father died when he was only 6, and so Wariston lived with his mother and sisters in the home of his grandparents, Archibald Johnston Sr. and Rachel Arnott. Now, Rachel Arnott was so influential in her day that at least one Episcopalian bishop called her the leader of the Melvillian party, the followers of Presbyterian champion Andrew Melville. And after her husband's death, she became known as one of the greatest conventicle keepers in the city of Edinburgh, hosting such leaders as David Dixon and Robert Bruce, who actually lived in hiding on their estate at the Sheens for several years while he was out of favor with King James. And this was the environment in which the young Wariston was raised. However, his formative years were years of great personal crisis, set against a backdrop of deep family tensions. New research reveals that his grandmother abruptly disinherited him of the estate his grandfather bequeathed him and gave it to an uncle instead. Wariston wrote in his diary, quote, "Even my grandfather and grandmother envied me and pitied me not, but cast me off or out from the portion of the world that I should have had." Now, this left his mother and siblings impoverished, living on an estate which rightfully belonged to him. And this upsetting experience may have given him some disillusionment about his Presbyterian roots, as we're going to see. But his personal sorrows were far from over. Wariston married his first wife, Jean Stewart, in 1632. She was barely 14 years of age, which was young even for that period. Wariston himself was 21. And it was apparently a very happy match, much spoken of throughout the city of Edinburgh. But their joy was not to last. After less than 8 months of marriage, he records in his diary, at 6 hours of the morning on 12th of June, 1633, it pleased God suddenly, for causes known to himself, to separate those souls which he had joined out of his love, and to take the one to eternal glory, and to leave the other plunged in an unspeakable misery. For the next 15 months, Wariston fell into a deep depression, and he didn't really fully emerge until his second marriage the following year. But it was this season of grief that prompted the beginning of his massive personal diary, which he maintained almost unbroken for the next 30 years. And those of you who will have read this diary or excerpts from it will know that it is disarmingly honest. It contains much that is worthy of emulation, and perhaps a lot also besides that is not. It contains an account of Covenanter spirituality at its best and arguably its worst. And as such, it supplies not only a valuable historical source, but an important pastoral document. Its value was recognized shortly after his death, and in the archives you can find lengthy excerpts faithfully copied down by 18th century Scottish Presbyterians like James Hogg and Robert Woodrow for their own personal edification. Woodrow wrote, quote, "I am of opinion that it would be a vast accession to our history, and which is unspeakably of more consequence to the interests of vital religion, if my Lord Wariston's diary could be copied." Now, just as an aside, Woodrow provides there a great example of what our priorities ought to be in studying church history. Retrieving archive sources like a 17th century spiritual journey, of course, has historical value. But in Woodrow's words, it is of unspeakably more consequence when such narrative writing is viewed as a pastoral discipline, serving the vital interests of religion in our congregations. As Paul said of the Old Testament redemptive history, these things are written as examples for our instruction. And while we don't equate redemptive history with church history, surely the same principle applies. To give just one example of the pastoral value of studying our forefathers' diaries and biographies, Wariston's diary, which was published in 3 edited volumes in the 20th century by the Scottish History Society, presents the reader with a remarkably candid case study of the symptoms and pastoral treatment of depression. Here we find the bold lawyer of the covenant, whom God was about to use to change the direction of the church and nation, wrestling with his dark thoughts and despair, even with suicidal ideation. And I think it's a reminder that some of the mightiest instruments in the Lord's hands are shaped by the deepest trials. God uses broken men and women to build his church, individuals with secret sorrows who, like Elijah, are in his wise providence brought to the brink of despair. Well, Wariston's diary enables us to chart his spiritual formation in these crisis years in more detail than we can possibly address this evening. But I think there are 4 or 5 things that really do need to be underlined. The first element of his spiritual formation is the ordinary means of grace. As we'd expect, the primary focus of Wariston's spirituality was, quote, "a diligent use of the ordinary means, since unto it the most part of the promises are annexed." And so, since that was Wariston's view of the means of grace, these ordinary means of Bible study, prayer, attending to sermons, communion, psalm singing were the bread and butter not only of his piety, but Covenanter piety in general. But there's also another factor that needs to be addressed, and it is legalism. Wariston's legalistic tendencies are found frequently in his diary and all throughout his life. They doubtless contributed to his depression as he failed to look to Christ and his finished work and was devoured instead by a slavish devotion to spiritual disciplines. Perhaps most significantly, they colored Wariston's perception of the biblical covenants. Whilst intellectually Wariston accepted an orthodox covenant theology, yet in his Christian life and practice, as recorded in the diary, he seems to have borne a very heavy legal burden by conflating the covenant of works with the covenant of grace. And that is not an uncommon pastoral issue in the 17th century, or indeed in our own day. It's hardly unique to Wariston, in which a Christian who has been saved by grace finds him or herself living constantly under the burden of the covenant of works. We might also add to this some surprising pastoral mentors in the diary. One of the most striking aspects of Wariston's spiritual formation is the remarkable breadth of pastoral influences that he embraced. We've already identified some key mentors from his family circle, men like David Dixon and Robert Bruce. But despite these staunch anti-Episcopalian roots, and perhaps fed by grievances by his domestic tensions, Wariston's most important pastoral influences in this period were in fact staunch Episcopalians. None is perhaps more surprising than his local pastor, who was none other than his grandparents' ecclesiastical nemesis, William Strother, the Dean of Edinburgh. Wariston regularly heard him preach, devoured his devotional writings, and even visited him on his deathbed. But he's not alone in this. Many early Covenanters appreciated the expository, practical preaching of ministers whom they would later evict from their pulpits at the Covenanting Revolution for their unyielding allegiance to prelacy and the king's innovations in the kirk's public worship. Another potentially controversial element we might call mysticism. While Wariston chiefly gave himself to the ordinary means, he also occasionally refers to what he calls extraordinary motions that he tended to experience during long hours of intense prayer in the night and also at the communion table. For instance, at one point in his diary, he writes, "During the like space of 2 hours, my soul was, I know not how, transported as it were, and ravished out of itself, as forgetful of my body, by a comforting, terrifying, uniting sense and sight of God's particular presence there and then with my soul, which made me to take 3 or 4 times my transporting shudderings." Now, much could be said about his apparent mystical experiences, which include very intense dreams that he interprets and even very specific premonitions. Wariston was nonetheless wholeheartedly committed to the ordinary means of grace. He saw these experiences as odd blessings, unusual and not to be sought out. He scrupulously avoided using the terminology of prophecy and interpreted these unusual experiences as providential applications of the final sufficient scriptures to present circumstances, and not a continuation of New Testament charismata. So in Wariston's formative years, we encounter a man in crisis, a complex man living in times that were also about to become extremely complex. He was generally orthodox in his theology, but he did have his errors. Some were perhaps due to his temperament, some due to his pastoral mentors. He was open to drawing pastoral benefit from a variety of sources that were reformed, but whose ecclesiastical differences he considered to be non-central at this early stage of his life. All this, of course, was about to change dramatically. The storm clouds of revolution were gathering, and while navigating a tempestuous personal life, Wariston would soon find himself thrust to the forefront of public affairs in the kingdom. So we move from crisis to the next chapter of his life, which is Covenanting. Covenanting 1637 to 1641. There is a gap in Wariston's diary from 1634, the year of his second marriage, to 1637, when he emerges as a leader of the Covenanters. And this begs the question, how did he move from what apparently was a somewhat moderate position, embracing Episcopalian ministers as his closest pastoral mentors, to being one of the most aggressive agents of the Second Reformation? Well, doubtless one of the great catalysts for this transformation lies in the Laudian reforms. In 36 to 37 rather, King Charles I imposed Archbishop Laud's Book of Canons and Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church. The Calvinist theological consensus of the Kirk was threatened by the incipient Arminian theology of the Laudian canons. And the consensus of Puritan piety was threatened by the liturgical straitjacket of the Laudian prayer book, which notoriously echoed the Roman Catholic Mass. Wariston's personal analysis of these reforms was thorough and unsparing. By a detailed analysis of the Laudian prayer book, the legal constitution of the Reformed Kirk, and relevant scriptures, and fueled by a number of ecstatic experiences during his closet prayers, he concluded the new Episcopalian prayer book to be the image of the beast, and that he must join the growing protest against it. It's striking that with the catalyst of government intrusion into the doctrine and worship of the church, matters of ecclesiology and eschatology, which had hitherto been considered secondary to Wariston, now became matters of first importance. The rhetoric of the diary abruptly changes, and the Presbyterian nonconformity of his childhood, which had seemingly been dormant, now came to dominate his horizon. The well-known response of Scottish Presbyterians to the Laudian reforms in the prayer book riots of 1637 is really outside the scope of this paper. However, throughout this Scottish Revolution, Wariston played a central role at every step. Although the mob was composed mostly of the common folk of Edinburgh, the real political threat to the king's authority lay with a group of powerful nobles led by the likes of the Earl of Loudon and influential ministers like Alexander Henderson and David Dixon. Soon these important public figures were looking to Wariston, who had just opened his own law practice in Edinburgh, looking for legal advice against the king. And Wariston quickly became their most trusted ally in providing a case against the king's intrusion into the church's spiritual independence. After many months of legal wrangling and royal subterfuge, the supplicants against the king finally made the decision, possibly at Wariston's suggestion, to bind themselves together again in defense of the religious liberties of the national kirk in the Scottish National Covenant, which was largely authored by Wariston and edited by Presbyterian elder statesman Alexander Henderson. On the 1st of March 1638, Wariston publicly read the covenant at the Market Cross of Edinburgh, and it was signed over the next several months by the majority of the Scottish population. Overjoyed, Wariston considered it to be the glorious marriage day of Christ with Scotland. The practical ecclesiastical effects of this revolutionary step were soon implemented by the Great Reforming General Assembly of 1638 in Glasgow, which completely abolished episcopacy in Scotland and re-established Presbyterianism. Wariston's kudos and administrative genius was by now well established, and he was appointed to serve both as clerk of the General Assembly and its prolocutor, overseeing all official publications of the Kirk of Scotland. By now, Wariston was firmly in the inner circle of the new revolutionary executive, which soon determined the only way to bring the stubborn king to terms was to raise an army in defense of their daring Second Reformation. In the subsequent Bishops' Wars of 1639 to 41, where the Blue Banner was first flown, Wariston was one of the key Scottish negotiators to broker the Treaty of London with the king. Now, King Charles's reputation for flattery and subterfuge is famous. And on this occasion, Wariston was among a number of political enemies who were knighted. This is where he became Lord Wariston. And of course, this was a futile attempt to try to buy them off. But it would not be enough for Charles to save his kingdom. There was a political storm coming as his enemies on both sides of the Tweed joined forces to overthrow his tyranny in the church and state. That brings us to the third chapter of our story this evening. We've seen crisis, we've seen covenanting, and we come third to Confederation. Given the remarkably universal response to his homeland to the National Covenant, Wariston anticipated that Scotland would be just the first of many Protestant nations discipled by Christ and entering into covenant with him, and as we shall see, covenanting with one another in a gospel confederation. His next targets were England and Ireland, and he began to pour his energies into a vision of the British Isles becoming a covenanted nation. While serving on behalf of the Covenanter executive in London during the negotiations to conclude the Bishops' Wars, Wariston was busy networking with disaffected English Puritans who were very excited about the Scottish overthrow of the king's impositions on the church, which of course they too had been enduring. Several of them were of the mind that they were on the brink of an eschatological milestone. Scotland's revolution against the semi-popery of prelacy would surely be a harbinger of the millennium. Now they needed to enter into covenant with Christ too, and events swiftly presented an opportunity. By 1643, relations between Charles and the English Parliament had deteriorated to the point of civil war. Charles's armies gained the upper hand on the battlefield, and the English Parliament was obliged to turn to Scotland for military support. Wariston was one of the first to seize upon the opportunity and prepared the initial draft of the Solemn League and Covenant, which he had been contemplating as early as the spring of 1638. He envisioned that the Solemn League would bring the three kingdoms into a British political confederation that would bring the king to terms of peace by force of combined arms. The joint committee of English and Scots that would carry out these political goals was called the Committee of Both Kingdoms. This was effectively the war room for the parliamentarian and Scottish side, managing the joint armies in their campaigns against the king. But Wariston also envisioned that the Solemn Covenant would then expand the religious goals of Scotland's national covenant to embrace the entire British Isles. The church in England and Ireland would be brought into covenanted uniformity of religion according to the model of the Second Reformation Scottish Kirk. That is, it would become both Reformed and Presbyterian. The joint committee of English and Scots who would carry out these religious goals was, of course, the Westminster Assembly of Divines. Now, Wariston is absolutely unique in that he is the only statesman to have served on both these important committees. And his zeal to see the terms of the Solemn League and Covenant implemented would consume this decade, although regrettably, his diary for the 1640s has been lost. As one of the 5 Scottish commissioners at the Westminster Assembly, Wariston was a ruling elder delegate. And now it seems that Wariston was particularly occupied with the business of the Committee of Both Kingdoms and wasn't particularly vocal in the debates of the Assembly itself. Though not a divine himself, he demonstrated that he was capable of expressing the Covenanter case with great eloquence and force. Probably his most famous speech was in defense of the mediatorial kingship of Christ over the church. It was made on the 1st of May, 1646, after Parliament backed down on a motion that the civil magistrate had the right to exercise judicial authority in the courts of the church. Wariston declared, "I am glad to hear the willingness of the Parliament to give Christ his full right and due. All men are bound to give a testimony to the truth when called to it. In former times, Christ hath gotten testimonies to his prophecy and priesthood. Now he looks to it for his kingdom. Christ is born for a crown, and now are all born to this end, to give testimony to this. There is a ground to you fully to assert the privileges of Jesus Christ. In all endeavors, it should be that to the uttermost we endeavor to exalt Christ as the only Lord over his church. Well, even though Wariston's diary for the 1640s is lost, the rest of this part of our story is very well documented. What began as a promising alliance between Scottish Covenanters and English Puritans began to unravel with the rise and prominence of the English independents, both on the battlefield with Oliver Cromwell's new model army and at the Westminster Assembly with the dissenting brethren. When the king surrendered, he cleverly exploited these divisions between the allies and also managed to divide the ranks of the Scottish Covenanters. In the so-called engagement of 1648, Wariston and many of the Kirk's ministers were outmaneuvered by several of their own Covenanting nobles, who secretly engaged with Charles to secure his throne by force in exchange for a religious settlement much weaker than the covenant they had formally sworn. For Wariston, it was simply a matter of divine justice that this engager army suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Cromwell at the Battle of Preston in 1648. But in an unusual twist, the victorious Cromwell propped up a new minority Scottish executive, manned by the stricter Covenanters who had opposed the engagement, known as the Kirk Party. Wariston was prominent in this government, and he led the charge to righteously purge the government and military of any malignants. These are those who had betrayed the covenants and supported the engager plan as he saw it. He also began to develop an appreciation for Cromwell's Puritan piety, while simultaneously distancing himself from Cromwell's independency. But this brief alliance between Kirk Party and Cromwell soon fell apart with the unexpected execution of Charles I the following year. This led to the Covenanters' fatal decision to court the young exiled heir to the throne, offering to bring him to Scotland and crown him as Charles II, upon condition of his swearing the covenants, which of course he duplicitously agreed to, despite his deep personal resentment towards the Covenanters and a scandalously immoral life. In a somewhat misguided effort to boost their new king's power base, a majority in the church backed the Scottish Parliament's public resolutions. These restored to office those Wariston had been busily purging from the executive and the army. And so Wariston immediately joined a full third of the Scottish clergy who registered their dissent from these resolutioners and became known as the Protesters, setting the stage for a decade of schism. Meanwhile, Cromwell and his army recognized the threat posed by the return of the younger Charles and marched north to Scotland, routing the Covenanter army at the Battle of Dunbar. As part of the committee sent to oversee the battle, Wariston found himself at the very center of this military debacle. In the bitter recriminations that followed, Wariston feared for his life, being personally blamed for the defeat due to his righteous purge of some of its best soldiers, and accused of making that fatal decision to descend upon Cromwell's fleeing army from their strategic position at Doon Hill that cost them the victory. A few months later, what remained of the Scottish army was defeated at the Battle of Worcester, and Charles II fled back to the continent, biding his time. The tragic demise of Wariston's vision for a British covenanted confederacy thus came about with the sad spectacle of an English Puritan army in pitched battle with a Scottish Covenanter army. A long 9-year English occupation of Presbyterian Scotland followed, and for Wariston, they would be years of church conflict, personal disillusionment, and a stunning compromise that would ultimately cost him his life. That brings us to the 4th chapter of our story. And that is a chapter marked by compromise, 1652 to 1660. Under Cromwell's occupation of Scotland, the Scottish Church faced new religious threats. The English sought to eradicate all ecclesiastical uniformity between the three kingdoms according to terms of the covenants. And instead, they imposed a policy of strict religious toleration. Wariston spent much of the decade furiously writing tracts and letters against these threats. As the prolocutor of the General Assembly in the previous decade, Wariston had been responsible for censoring theological literature that had been flooding into Scotland, becoming an extremely well-read polemicist for the Kirk against a rising tide of English congregationalism, which threatened the Presbyterian hegemony. Meanwhile, the schism over the public resolutions continued throughout the decade, with former clerical allies bitterly divided into resolutioner and protester parties. Wariston really became the arch protester. His intellectual gifts and energies were poured into stoking the fires of debate and division rather than assuaging them. He wrote and published several papers questioning the validity of the resolutioner assemblies, such as the nullity of the pretended assembly at St. Andrews and Dundee in 1652. He also penned the first draft of the better-known Causes of the Lord's Wrath against Scotland, which is usually attributed, of course, to James Guthrie. Wariston was soon accused by prominent resolutioners as, quote, the cause of all the distance and division, and even the ruiner of the Kirk of Scotland. Well, in an effort to reunite the feuding parties of the Kirk, Cromwell summoned representatives from both sides to a series of meetings in London, chaired by none other than John Owen. James Sharp, the future notorious Archbishop of St. Andrews, debated for the Resolutioner party against Wariston. Cromwell was impressed by Wariston's arguments and abilities during these debates. Here was a man whose gifts might be put to good use in his executive if he could be persuaded. And so after a period of considerable pressure from the Lord Protector and much prayer and soul searching, Wariston shocked his friends by accepting government office in Cromwell's protectorate in 1656. He accepted several roles: a Commissioner of Justice for Scotland, Lord Clerk Register, and he was also the only Scot to sit in Cromwell's reconstructed House of Lords in London. These actions by Wariston led him to be seen as a betrayer of the covenant by former colleagues. His disappointed friend, James Guthrie, even called him somewhat sarcastically, our independent. So how can we explain this compromise on the part of the normally unpragmatic arch-covenanter, Archibald Johnston of Wariston? Let me suggest a couple of things. For one thing, there was a growing spiritual affinity between the Presbyterian Wariston and the English independent Puritans. Wariston was building close spiritual friendships with men like Owen and Cromwell and had a growing appreciation for their common Puritan piety. Secondly, Wariston struggled with personal insecurities. They're writ large in his diary throughout the 1650s. It's clear he was deeply hated by the Scottish public. His position of leadership during the wars had led many to hold him personally responsible for national military losses during the conflicts. For another thing, Wariston was under considerable personal economic stress. There's very good evidence that he had not been especially responsible with his domestic finances, and the wars had left him with many outstanding debts. Fourth, and closely connected with the financial stress, were many familial woes. Wariston was close to poverty, with 13 children to feed, and an eldest son showing undoubtable signs of insanity. Ever sensitive to the leadings of Providence, he read this unexpected opportunity to return to public life as an open door to alleviate his private losses. Yet, while he enjoyed considerable political prestige in this period, he came to bitterly regret this move at the end of his life, when Cromwell died and Charles II was restored to the throne. But ironically, it was during this decade of tragic deepening rifts in the Kirk and of the compromise with Cromwell that Wariston arguably made his greatest theological contribution, one that would impact the church for centuries to come. As the new political masters of Scotland, Cromwell's agents did all they could to eradicate the memory of the Scottish covenants. But Wariston's former emphasis on covenanting didn't vanish altogether. Rather, it was redirected. He intensified his youthful practice of personal covenanting, writing out his own personal covenant with God in a similar manner to the many legal documents he had prepared and signing it as his personal testimony. He went on to encourage each of his family members to do likewise, and before long was actively promoting this practice among his fellow protesters, even writing a now lost paper on soul covenanting with God. It's probably not an exaggeration to credit Wariston as a major catalyst for this practice of personal covenanting going mainstream in Scottish Presbyterianism and beyond. And that is largely due to his persuasion of a close ministerial friend to prepare a treatise on the subject. The minister was William Guthrie of Fenwick, and the book, A Trial of a Saving Interest in Christ. This work, which was originally Wariston's brainchild, was published in many languages and has stayed in print almost consistently ever since. John Owen famously remarked that there was more divinity in this one volume than in all of his own works put together. And as this remark from Owen suggests, the personal covenanting ideal resonated deeply even with the independents, who took up the practice as individuals and as gathered congregations, both in England and in New England in subsequent centuries. Thus, our forefathers learned to walk between two extremes, the tyranny of episcopacy and what we might call the tyranny of conscience. The former lesson was learned by the pre-covenant generation as they faced Laudian liturgical impositions in worship, as well as the covenanters of the post-restoration killing times, who, of course, endured even worse. The latter lesson, the tyranny of conscience, was that learned by the covenanters in the Cromwellian era. Well, I want to come to this final chapter, the last 3 years of Wariston's life, which I've entitled Compunction. These last 3 years are a sad tale of compunction. That just means deep regret and soul searching. When Charles II was restored to power in 1660, despite his promise of clemency towards tender consciences, of course, he had personal scores to settle. Among these were the political and spiritual leadership of the Scottish Covenanters, who had compelled him to swear the covenants as a condition to recover his crown back in 1651. Of these men, Samuel Rutherford died before he could heed the summons to his trial. The Marquis of Argyll was beheaded and James Guthrie hanged. All had been Wariston's close friends and colleagues in the Covenanter cause. Wariston, however, managed to escape, and he escaped to the continent, where he lived as a fugitive for 3 years in the Netherlands and Germany, and eventually in France, where he went into hiding in the village of Lanteau near Rouen. Charles had spies searching for Wariston, and it's recorded that he survived at least one assassination attempt by poisoning, followed by the draining of 60 ounces of blood by the king's physician posing as a friend. These events left him in a state of understandable physical weakness and mental derangement. Finally, his wife was identified by the king's agents, and who secretly followed her to their lodgings, where Wariston was seized while at prayer. He was extradited from France, spent a year in the Tower of London before being sent for what amounted to a show trial in Edinburgh. Wariston's trial was, by all accounts, a pathetic sight. He sobbed and begged for his life, all the while having apparently lost his memory. Even the hardest of judges were visibly moved. Nevertheless, he was quickly found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Remarkably, however, in the days before his execution, his senses seemed to have returned, and he managed to compose a truly remarkable final testimony. You can read it in Woodrow. Let me give you just a brief excerpt from that last testimony. I am pressed in conscience to leave here at my death my true and honest testimony in the sight of God and man unto and for the national covenant, the solemn league and covenant. I do here submit and commit my soul and body, wife and children, and their children's children, from generation to generation, forever, with all others, our Lord's friends and followers, and all his doing, suffering, witnessing, and sympathizing ones, in the present and subsequent generations, unto the Lord's choicest mercies, graces, favors, in earth and in heaven, in time and eternity. All which suits I leave before the throne, and upon the Father's merciful heart, and the Son's mediating merits, and the Holy Spirit's compassionating groans, for now and forevermore. Amen. Wariston was hanged, beheaded, and his head was affixed next to Guthrie's skull on the Netherbow port. As we conclude, I think it's fair to say that Wariston's story is worth telling, but it's worth telling honestly. Wariston was a polarizing figure in his own day, and as I've suggested, he remains a polarizing figure today among historians of early modern Scottish history. Our tendency, perhaps, as heirs of the Scottish Second Reformation, can be to leap to the defense of one of our forefathers and rescue his reputation from the aspersions of historians today. But as we've considered the contours of his life and career, we need to remember that however much in sympathy we may be with the cause he lived and died for, we do need to be free from hagiography. The task of a Christian historian is certainly to tell a good story, but also to deal honestly with the sources, to provide an accurate assessment of the past. We might say that it is a Ninth Commandment issue. As Christian historians, we ought not propose the unattainable examples of covenanting saints, but paint realistic portraits of sinners saved by grace, men of like passions, whom Christ was pleased to use to build his church in difficult times, despite their many personal faults. Specifically, Wariston shows how the Scottish Second Reformation bore a particular testimony to the kingly office of Christ. As Wariston declared at the Westminster Assembly, quote, "In former times Christ hath gotten testimonies to his prophecy and priesthood, but now he looks to it for his kingdom. Christ is born for a crown, and now all are born to this end, to give testimony to this." All of church history is a record of Christ's kingly power. not just the small corner of Scottish Reformation and post-Reformation history that the members and friends of this society perhaps enjoy so very much. But 400 years on, as heirs of the Scottish Reformations, we continue to proclaim Christ in all three of his offices. And perhaps especially we're being called to give a testimony to how his kingly office should be applied to the time and place in which we live. Wariston's applications of this truth in his generation might not always be exactly what would be appropriate for our age, nor ours for his. And yet, the same Christ reigns in both generations. So let's pray that by his Spirit, he would direct us how to discerningly follow in the footsteps of our Second Reformation forefathers as servants of the King, who is also the Lord of history. Thank you very much.